Hi, it's Tim Grant.
And Nikki McLeod from the Right and Wrongs podcast.
This episode contains descriptions of terrorist mass casualty events and torture. As always, listener discretion is advised.
Our discussion will, as always, include an in-depth analysis of how forensic linguistic techniques played a role in unravelling the truth behind the story.
We hope you enjoy the show.
Writing Wrongs, an original podcast series from the Aston Institute for Forensic Linguistics. Season 3, Case 1, Part 2. Dhiren Barot, Al-Qaeda's al-Britani.
Hello, and welcome to Writing Wrongs, the podcast from AIFL, the Aston Institute for Forensic Linguistics at Aston University. We're all about improving the delivery of justice through the analysis of language. I'm Professor Tim Grant.
And I'm Dr. Nikki McLeod, Deputy Director of AIFL.
This is part 2 of the Dhiren Barot story. If you've not yet listened to part 1, you'd probably want to do that first.
So in part 1, we heard a lot about Barot's background. We heard how he was born in India. He moved to the UK as a small child. His family were Hindu. He was brought up Hindu, but as a young adult, he began to attend the Finsbury Park Mosque, where he was radicalised by Abu Hamza.
We heard about how he travelled to Pakistan and Afghanistan, where he was trained and fought in Kashmir against the Indians as a foot soldier. We learned about his association with Khalid Sheikh Mohammed, known as KSM, and Osama bin Laden, and how before 2001 he was sent on various trips to the United States to recce or case targets such as the New York Stock Exchange and the World Trade Center. All of this leads up to Barot's return to London in early 2001, from where there are various trips to Pakistan.
We heard how in June 2004, Barot was already under surveillance by UK authorities. But then in Lahore, in July 2004, a computer expert was arrested by Pakistani security forces. And as part of that arrest, they also recovered this document, the rough presentation to the Gas Limos project. Now, we heard how Barot was named as the author of the Gas Limos project by KSM, but also that this was highly likely to have occurred as a result of torture. And we heard how the CIA had informed the British authorities once they had this information. So for lots of good reasons, an allegation produced under torture cannot be used as evidence in the criminal courts in this country. So that created a problem because the police investigators obviously needed to charge Barot. They had him in custody and they needed some evidence that would actually stand up in court. So they've stumbled across forensic linguistics. However, they've managed to do that. And we're going to hear now about what happens next. So let's open the case file.
On Thursday, the 12th of August 2004 at 2 p.m, Tim Grant, forensic linguist, and Jessica Woodhams, forensic psychologist, were in an unmarked police car travelling at 125 miles per hour between Leicester and London. Tim had received a call at 11:20 that morning from SO13, the UK Metropolitan Police's counter-terrorism branch. The police had arrested suspected al-Qaeda terrorist Dhiren Barot 9 days previously, but had no admissible evidence with which to charge him. This meant that they had to get the evidence or release him in just 4 days' time. Intelligence, probably extracted under torture from Khalid Sheikh Mohammed, suggested that Barot was the author of a document, rough presentation to the Gas Limos project. The Gas Limos project was a plot to pack limousines full of gas cylinders, which would be simultaneously exploded in underground car parks at hotels and tower blocks across London, causing mass casualties. There were also further plans in the document to include radioactive materials in the explosions so that they would become dirty bombs. The police investigators needed a linguistic authorship analysis to prove a criminal standard that Barot had indeed written the Gas Limo project. Having assessed the scale of the task, Tim phoned around to gather a small team. First, he called Jessica Woodhams, who had previously worked as a crime analyst within the Metropolitan Police and was now a lecturer in forensic psychology at the University of Leicester with Tim. Next, he called forensic linguist Janet Cotterill at Cardiff University and asked Janet to bring with her PhD student Sam. A couple of hours after the initial phone call, an unmarked police car had picked up Tim from his home address outside Leicester, a city about 100 miles north of London, and travelled south to pick up Jess from the small rural town in Northamptonshire in which she lived. On the way out of town, travelling at about 90 miles per hour, they passed a community police officer bicycling down country lanes. As that police officer wobbled and nearly fell off his bike, what he couldn't see was that Tim had his head under the dashboard, holding together the faulty circuit that enabled the car's flashing lights and police siren. Just after Tim and Jessica arrived in New Scotland Yard, Janet and Sam arrived, looking slightly green from their journey. The initial plan had been to bring all four of them to London by helicopter, but Janet and Sam had also been driven by a specialist police driver from Cardiff University to London. It was now about 3 p.m, and in front of the four of them was a printout of the rough presentation to the Gas Limos project. The team were told, but by the following evening, the Friday, they had to complete their evidential report. On the Saturday, that linguist report would be passed to Barot's team for their consideration so that he could be interviewed about the report's content. And then, on the Sunday, the decision would have to be made to charge or release him.
So, before we get further into the story, let's introduce our guest today. We have joining us Jessica Woodhams, Professor of Forensic Psychology at the University of Birmingham, which is just around the corner from us here at Aston.
So Jess is a chartered forensic psychologist and director of Birmingham University's ESRC Centre for Understanding Behaviour. We've been long-term friends and collaborators since we were colleagues together at the University of Leicester in the early 2000s. Jess has many impressive credentials. Her primary area of research interest is the investigation of sexual crime, and she specialises in co-producing methods, more recently software, with the UK and international policing communities. Her work to create and implement an AI decision support tool for crime analysis was recently highly commended by the UK Home Office. So welcome, Jess.
Thank you.
Welcome, Jess. It's a pleasure to have you here. Actually, it's a paper that you, Tim, and you, Jess, co-authored that first set me on the route, my research kind of trajectory up to now. So you co-authored a paper about categorizing rapist speech using a sort of pragmatic framework, and that made me think, well, someone should look at what the victim says. And then I thought, I can see the headlines now. This is what you should say to not get raped. I thought, well, no, I'm not going to do that. So that was what kind of, then my interest was piqued in investigative interviewing from some other source, and I kind of brought those together. And that's
I didn't know that.
Yeah,
There you go.
yeah,
We're an inspiration to me.
yeah, absolutely. So, so great to have you here. You listened to the first part of this episode, and the case file that we've just heard, obviously, which is very much kind of based on Tim's memories of the day. What do you remember from that time? And perhaps it's an idea to think about. How did you end up working with Tim at Leicester? And let's kind of start there.
Sure. So I did a master's in forensic psychology, and then straight out of that worked for the Metropolitan Police as a crime analyst. And my daily job was trying to identify stranger rape series in London using behavioural analysis. And then, having done that job for a while, I then moved to the University of Leicester, where I met Tim and learned about his research in authorship analysis, read his PhD, so start to finish, which was really interesting. And and I think probably at that time we realised that there is some overlap between crime linkage and authorship analysis.
So let's focus in on this case in particular then, the Gas Limo project. We heard the opening of the text in the last episode, but let's just have a bit of a reminder and revisit that. So we'll hear the opening of that text again.
Rough presentation for Gas Limos project. At the outset, it is to be emphasized that the following information that is provided here is only a very small summarized account of a project that is in full, by far more detailed and available in its entirety upon request, inshallah. For the research of this project, attention was given to being as detailed as possible regarding facts, so much so that it took an entire year to complete Al-Mudillah. All information furnished here is not from results obtained from a singular source, but rather the details have been checked multiple times through independent sources, specialist libraries, books, internet, viewing, etc. Primary objectives: 1. Able to benefit Deen. 2. To be able to inflict mass damage and chaos. 3. ease of procurement for materials. 4. Relatively safe for handling. 5. Internationally applicable, transferable. Since in much of the Western world it is not always possible or feasible to obtain real destructive ingredients, e.g. common explosives, from the very beginning the project was based on being an improvised destructive device, hence the choice of gas. Gas can, within certain perimeters, be employed to cause large-scale damage to structures, since many of them, gas types, are by nature extremely flammable as well as explosive. It is just a question of knowing and understanding their behavioral patterns well. Following this, things can be customized to the saboteur's terrorist needs, inshallah.
Maybe Tim, perhaps you can tell us a bit more about the document itself.
So on that afternoon in August, we were presented with the paper documents. I think that's really important. I had been told that we could have it typed up, that the police would provide essentially typists or transcribers to type up the document, but we decided that would introduce errors and things that we might be interested in. It was 39 pages, and it was essentially a business plan. It was pitching an investment to al-Qaeda that for only £60,000 they could achieve a certain amount of death and destruction. And the plan involved 6 operatives, 3 main drivers and 3 armed decoy drivers, prepared to die in the attempt, but this wasn't a suicide attack. Barot envisaged them to be armed with Uzis and grenades so they could attempt to fight their way out of the situation if that became necessary. It was a rough cut or a rough presentation of a plan. Not all the details worked out. Some bits were very detailed, other bits were just ideas. For example, there's a whole section on acquiring radioactive materials, but that's not very credible or very well worked out. It's not fully worked out. That the document, the rough presentation document itself, refers to a more detailed document, but it's unclear whether this was ever written. I've certainly never seen whether there was a bit that filled in those more sketchy areas. And at this stage, at our arrival in New Scotland Yard, all we had was that document. I should say it was referred to as NAL6, which was its evidence number.
Okay.
Yeah. And we referred to it as the GLP, the Gas Limo project, the title of the document, and it was saved under a file called Eminem2, as in the rap artist.
So spelled out Eminem.
Yeah,
Right,
EMINEM. Yeah,
interesting.
and things like that. But the title of the document, sort of on the first page, was the rough presentation to the Gas Limos project. Initially, when we arrived, the police were still looking for comparison materials known to have been written by Barot. So they hadn't. I'd asked for that in the phone call. I said, well, it's all very well. What comparison documents you have? And it was like, oh, you'll need something to compare it to, of course.
Obviously,
Yeah?
yes.
And so basically what we did is we sat down with highlighters and Post-its and just started reading, really closely reading as thoroughly as we could through the text in front of us.
Okay, and what about you, Jess? What can you add anything to that? Do you remember what your first impressions were of the document?
Yeah, it was really very businesslike. So it was setting out the plan, and I think it was quite surreal reading a business pitch to basically murder many people. And I think I was shocked by the callousness of it, the way that was discussed, and the sort of the monetary pitch associated with that. And I think the effort that had gone into creating it, the recce's that he had gone on to be able to put this business plan together.
Yeah. Okay. So very well researched and kind of cold, I guess. Yeah. And Tim, you said you only had that document initially, but then they did provide some sort of comparison materials, so some what we would call K documents known to be written by Barot. So can you talk about those?
Yes, so we have in our authorship analysis work, we refer to Q documents, queried or questioned documents, and then K documents, known documents. And in fact, ultimately, we got more of each, more questioned documents and more known documents. because there were various stages of analysis. So there was the overnight analysis we performed that Thursday into the Friday. I remember I had to leave about 3 o'clock on the Friday, and I think the three of you stayed a bit later
Yeah.
and received another document then, which was known. So on that first night, which lasted to, I recall 3 or 4 in the
4 in
morning.
the morning.
Yeah, something like that. We had just the Gas Limo project document. The next day, the next morning when we got up, having slept for at least 3 hours, we received some K-Doc texts, some K-documents. And these were quite scrappy documents, but I mean small amounts of text. So there were some travel insurance claims that had arrived late overnight. So where Barot had lost bags and lost passports and lost items, mostly in airports, and it had the feel that he was checking out airport security and things like that. And if you imagine filling in an insurance claim, you write a little paragraph explaining what's happened. There were those kind of little paragraphs. On the Friday, we received some job application letters. And jobs in the tourist industry and airports and so on. And again, Barot had been working for Air Malta in their London office, not in an airport, but he was looking for a transfer to Malta airports, and he had some other application for other things. And there was a CV in amongst them. And again, in those kind of documents, you do get short text and short paragraphs, but no real long flowing text. So we've talked on Writing Wrongs before about the difficulty of cross-genre analysis. These are completely the wrong genre for comparison documents for what we want to do. But that was what we had. That was it. By the time we arrived at the trial date, which was in August, September 2006, 2 years later, there was lots and lots more documents. As I've said, there were documents he had known to have written. So this included letters to his family from prison. He was close with his sister, although pretty much estranged from his parents. There were email correspondence. It was later that I received a set of handwritten notebooks, photocopies of handwritten notebooks. There was the book that we referred to in the first episode, his adventures in Kashmir, and the book was called The Army of Medina in Kashmir. And there were lots of other bits and pieces.
So still none of these are an exact match for the sort of business plan.
No, that's right. There was no other known text that was absolutely the equivalent genre. The list of question texts also grew. So files were decrypted from Barot's computer and were received from various intelligence sources as well. The laptop in Pakistan that had been seized with Khan's arrest, the computer programmer's arrest in Lahore, and other things were found. And there were a lot of these research documents about hazardous materials and handling explosives and so on, and fire suppression systems in buildings and the like. He did a lot of sort of technical research. And we had the recce documents as well, which the research reports about the targets across the eastern United States. And perhaps most interestingly were the textual captions on videos that he added. So there were these little scraps of text which would scroll across the bottom of a video as he was taking video of, say, the frontage of the New York Stock Exchange. Mostly they were commentary on the security features. You could see a security camera on the corner there and things like that. But even though it's a bit of a spoiler, I should add that ultimately these tiny little fragments of text also contained our linguistic features. So they were question documents, but in the end I concluded there was evidence that they might be by Barot.
Okay, so these are the videos you mentioned in the last part where the like the kind of captions had been added after 9/11, but the videos dated from prior.
Yeah, the videos all had dates prior. There was no, as I understood it, no forensic evidence as when the captions had been added, but some of them had definitely been added after the 9/11 attack. So the videos were taken at the latest in the spring of 2001. And then obviously 9/11 was September 2001. And some of the captions said that this security might have been tightened now since the Twin Towers.
Right.
So you knew that they'd been added after. But there wasn't I was never aware of a very concrete timeline around that.
Okay, so let's jump back to the Gas Limos project document and start thinking about the sort of features that you identified there. So early evening on the Thursday when you get there, you start reading the Gas Limo project. How did you start? What were you looking for from the outset? Jess, do you remember anything about that?
But I think we were initially reading them to determine if there was something salient in there. That's a term that we'd use in crime linkage analysis. So we were looking to see if there were maybe unusual linguistic features within there that might then be repeated across the texts. And that's really similar to what a crime analyst would do, analysing sexual offending behaviour, be looking to see, is there a behaviour here that's unusual or rare, and are there features here that are likely to be reproduced across crimes? So it'd be similar, is there something here that's distinctive, unusual, rare, that might be repeated? So yeah, my memory was reading through it, and I, I'm not a linguist, and I think one of the things I was most conscious of was not therefore having the expert knowledge of what is a distinctive linguistic feature. So I would know what it is for rape and sexual offending behaviour, but not knowing what was distinctive linguistically. And so reading through and seeing things and saying to Tim and Janet, this seems unusual to me. Is it?
Yeah, I remember we had, on this point of distinctiveness, it was really awkward because we were just dependent on our intuitions mostly. And we'll talk a bit about how we checked out those intuitions later. But so it was using our background as linguists. And in that sense, we had the three linguists and then Jess, who, when we were driving down and when we were first presented with, we didn't know what we were going to be faced with. And it just felt really useful to have you there, Jess, partly because you'd worked in the Metropolitan Police before in this analysis work, but also there might have been behavioural things that you would have picked up on more, or, so it's interesting that you felt that lack of expertise.
Yeah.
So you conducted kind of a close reading of this Gas Limos project, and there are certain features here that have kind of jumped out that might be distinctive and might be indicators of the author's style. Can we perhaps have a little bit of a summary of those?
Yeah, we're going to go into them in more detail in a minute, but we identified that evening. We identified 5 features that we thought were salient in Jess's terms. We don't usually use that word particularly. We'd say distinctive or
Marked.
Yeah. Marked is a linguistic term for this. So there were issues with his formality of writing. Now, this is an interesting one, which we'll go into, but he was both over-formal and under-formal for the genre. There were what we called repeated units of semantic similarity, and these came in various versions where he would say 2 words which meant basically the same thing in a row. And there was the use of scare quotes. And I remember you enjoyed that, Jess, didn't you? Because you've not heard the term scare quote before.
No.
So do you want to explain to us what a scare quote is?
I do remember seeing these quotation marks and saying to you, this looks unusual, is it?
Yeah. So for the other non-linguists who might be listening, a scare quote is where you put speech marks around a term to indicate that you are using it unusually. And in the podcast studio where you can't see me very well, you kind of can mark it with your fingers as well as quotations around a piece. And it's not actually acting as a quotation. It's the writer saying, this is an unusual usage for something. So we linguists like to refer to those as scare quotes. There was a heavy use of slashes to indicate alternates or alternative ideas. And it's not that you never see slashes in writing. It was the rate of use that's marked. And a dodgy use of semicolons. And we'll get to that in a minute. I mean, it's one of my favorite things because nobody knows how to use a semicolon except these days ChatGPT. So we'll go into each of these in more detail in a bit. But those 5 features really were the core of the analysis, not only that night, but over the next 2 years, as we'll hear.
Yeah. So this was all kind of based on your intuitive reading. Did you do anything else?
Yeah, I mean, basically, the reading that evening was a really old school stylistic analysis, what seems odd to us. And we elicited just those 5 features. Later, after Barot was charged, Janet and I did some corpus linguistic work and some open internet searching to try and establish base rate distinctiveness of those features. And later still, I carried out some sort of confirmatory analysis and arrived at a basket of about 20 or more features. Yeah, but they performed no role in the analysis that night.
Okay, so what corporate did you use for this comparison?
Okay, so I used the Bank of English, which
Okay, we've spoken about this, haven't we?
yes, in our last historical episode where we talked about the Derek Bentley case, we talked about how Malcolm Coulthard used the Bank of English, and it had a massive 1.5 million words
Yeah,
of English at the time.
massive for the time. Yeah.
By the time we get to the Barot case, the Bank of English, which I think is now defunct, but the co-billed corpus was 57 million words.
Okay.
So you can use a corpus like that to search for linguistic features. But if you think about the sort of features I've just referred to, they're quite hard to search for using corpus methods. The over or under formality thing isn't amenable to corpus linguistics. And back in the day, it was harder to search for sort of punctuation features using corpora. There are methods now that we could use, but that's where we post hoc were reinforcing the idea that these were distinctive, that our intuitions were correct.
Okay, so we're gonna go into these features in a bit more detail. So beginning with the one you mentioned there, the formality feature, we're gonna hear a little extract from your report and from the data.
When reading NAL 6, one feature of the writing which became apparent was that the writers seemed ill at ease with the level of formality they were attempting. The document was read as being analogous to a business proposal where a more junior member of an organisation was seeking approval of more senior decision makers. In this situation, it might be expected that the intention is to impress not only with the content, but also with the written style. The result in the text is an over-formality, sometimes resulting in errors in word selection, particularly of rarer and longer words. This is occasionally interspersed with dramatic under-formality, such as the use of internet and mobile telephone texting abbreviations.
Sportsmen, when sustaining injuries such as sprains during competition tournaments, commonly utilize these packs.
So, Jess, do you remember this example?
Yeah, I do, because I remember the formal style of the business pitch, really, is in terms of what it was. And then occasionally you would have this informality or underformality, such as FYI. Yeah, it would be presented alongside a more formal language.
Okay, so you wouldn't really expect that in that particular type
No.
of text. So this is quite interesting because it's like you say, it's difficult to find a feature like this in a corpus, but it's not really the sort of thing you'd expect to see probably in an authorship analysis now.
That's right. It's a very sort of stylistic feature, and I guess they've fallen out of fashion for a couple of reasons. First, because it seems quite dependent on the expertise of the analyst rather than be something that can be measured sort of more objectively. I mean, there are language features within there, but it's still quite a subjective feature. And second, that it's hard to establish base rates and things like that. And most of our base rate work is based on computational searches, and it's difficult to do that with this kind of sort of pragmatic feature. I guess you call it a discourse level feature, like this over or under use of formality. But I think it is a shame because these are the sort of features that can persist across genres if you have the correct genre conditions. So if you think about the job application, you might also be writing at your highest level of formality when writing a job application. So you can consider good comparisons across the texts in those kind of words, in those kind of ways. And when you and I, Nikki, we did our work on language disguise, what we were able to conclude was these higher level linguistic features are perhaps the bits that are resistant to disguise.
Yes.
And so the low level stuff that's easy to compute, people can also spoof easily. Compute.
Yeah.
But this stuff is harder. So there's all sorts of reasons why it's unusual today, but maybe a valuable sort of language feature.
Yeah, absolutely. So, okay, we'll move on to the next feature. And this is the one that you called repeated units of semantic similarity. And there's one there in the example. Actually, it talks about during competition tournaments. So you wouldn't expect to see competition and tournament because they're essentially synonyms. So that kind of repetition of meaning, it's a bit quirky, isn't it?
Yeah, and it's something the author of the Gas Limo project does in several different ways. And as that example shows, the during competition tournaments example shows, sometimes there were no brackets, no punctuation, just the two words, one following the other. But sometimes, for example, brackets were used.
This substance is poisonous, toxic.
This has brackets around the word toxic, and sometimes scare quotes were used instead that we just discussed.
In rural countryside areas,
In fact, the use of scare quotes in all sorts of contexts was really prevalent, so that the use of scare quotes became a feature in its own right, but it's also here in this feature of repeated semantic similarity. Finally, there were a couple of other punctuation features. So there was an overuse of slashes in things like doctors/nurses, and there was also a weird use of semicolons in the Gas Limo project. So there's all sorts of ways we can misuse a semicolon. But what he did very frequently was used it after the word because, as in, because, semicolon, it seems at an early stage of something or other. So that semicolon in that position after the word because is particularly unusual. But that list of features, basically 5 features, some with a couple of variants, was pretty much it at the end of our first night. And as we've said, we went to bed. I think we stopped the analysis at about 3 a.m.
Yeah.
And there's a very fancy hotel quite close to New Scotland Yard, the Victoria Park Hilton, was it? Or something like that, Victoria Park Hotel, where we were all given really nice rooms high up the tower block for the night and slept there for about 2.5, 3 hours. And I don't think we stayed for breakfast. I can't remember.
I think we brought it in with us.
Yeah, and we took a pack-up breakfast, so didn't make any use of this lovely hotel in the middle of London. We'd struggled to afford to stay now. But we got up and started again to look at the text, this time that Barot was known to have written. By that Friday morning, we started to get the known texts in.
Okay, so before we get into the known text, I wanted to ask Jess if she has any comments on this approach, kind of as a method. Does it sort of resonate with you in terms of case linkage and that kind of thing?
Yeah, it would be really similar to how you would do case linkage or crime linkage if you didn't have a computerized database to help you. So most crime linkage units across the world who are looking at sexual offences and murders, they have a computerized database that you can query. So where you have an index crime, which would be like your query text, you would search that database to see if there was anything else that was similar to that crime. And then you would analyse it to look to see if there are features that are consistent between your index offence and other crimes that have been returned from your search. And then where you identify similarities in behaviour, you would then consider the distinctiveness of those similarities. So are these features seen in all sexual offences or all homicides, or are they actually quite unusual in this population of crimes? So it was very similar to what you do without the database. You'd be looking for things that look distinctive or unusual based on your expert knowledge, and then you'd look to see if those are consistently repeated in the other crimes or in the other texts as we had here.
Okay, so looking for things that you might expect to also occur elsewhere if in fact you're looking at
The same.
the same person.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, so here we come to it. You've said over the 2 days that you just had a couple of documents of Barot's known writing. So you've said insurance claim documents where he'd lost luggage or whatever at airports or on flights, job applications, and later on you got all sorts of other stuff. So the big question is really, were these features that you've identified in the Gas Limo project, were they present in these known documents?
So the short answer is, of course, yes. But let's just take a couple of examples from one of the job applications and a letter to an insurance company, and let's listen to that. Here's the formality example from the job application letter.
rotating for monthly durations.
Here's some formality examples from the insurance letter.
I have tried exhaustingly to obtain the report. I had done the aforementioned. My ex-employer's company is now long deceased.
And a scare quote example from the same letter.
He is generally good at his job.
That had the word generally in scare quotes, and the next example has the word employment in brackets.
My job, employment has been.
Are we looking at good evidence of shared authorship here?
I think the main problem with this analysis is demonstrating that those features that we used are distinctive. Okay. I think that we can show in some detail and increasing detail after the event that there are good features that occur across these documents of known authorship and of questioned authorship. We're sort of, for me, doing the analysis in the wrong direction. I like to demonstrate the features in the known documents first, and then look at the questioned documents, because there's issues of bias for doing that. But we've got that carry across that these features occur in both sets of documents. The real problem is the establishing distinctiveness, and we've just rested that on our expertise as linguists. There's no demonstration of it at this point in the analysis, and there's no demonstration of it really in those first reports.
What do you think, Jess? Was it good evidence?
Yeah, I'd say the same as Tim. I think high quality report would have been able to demonstrate that those commonalities between the texts were also distinctive to that author, if we're assuming there is one author.
There's all sorts of assumptions we're making of this, aren't there? That's another assumption that went unquestioned on the day, I think, that the Gas Limo project was a single authored text.
Yes.
Okay, but this is all you've got, basically.
Yes.
And the clock's ticking, and I don't think they're going to let you leave until you've given them an answer. But you and Janet decide to write this up as a joint report. So what's the kind of conclusions that you're able to draw then?
So what we did in that report, there was a publication a couple of years before which suggested how best to express results of forensic identification evidence. And what we did is we described it as a moderate weight of evidence for, and in some cases, a moderately strong weight of evidence for the same authorship. And those judgments varied a little bit. I went through text by text that we had. I remember there was some pressure so we've not mentioned this already, all through the night, the Thursday night and on the Friday, we had various bigwigs visiting the room saying, haven't you come up with an answer yet? Can't you tell us it's him? And things like that. And one of them, I think, was Peter Clark, who was the head of counter-terrorism policing in the UK at the time. And then there was people from the CPS who would come and talk to us and listen to us. And they were fairly senior people, and they'd turn to the police officers and say, no, I'm not convinced. And then they'd go away again and we'd be left to say there was loads of pressure to come up with an answer, and above all, the right answer. And this is no way to carry out a forensic analysis. You're meant to be independent.
And they were pressurizing for it to be expressed percentage-wise?
So that's what I was coming to. Yes. So they wanted us to say, what percentage certain are you? Rather than these words of a moderate weight of evidence for. And we resisted that. That's not in our final report. We didn't do the percentages bet. But on the Friday, Janet and I wrote a report, and that was then passed to Barot's legal team for them to read. And it was
Was it put to him in interview?
yes, he so this is all the process that you would expect to happen. If you've got evidence to charge someone, that evidence has to be put to them in police interviews. So they've got a chance to respond to that evidence and put their side of the case, say, yes, I did write it, no, I didn't write it. And naturally, of course, Barot no commented all his interviews at this stage. So that means he chose to use his right to silence. He made no comment when presented with any evidence. And on the Sunday, the CPS decided that this linguistic evidence that we had produced as a team was sufficient to charge Barot. And what is utterly terrifying is that our evidence, our linguistic evidence, was the only evidence that they had to charge Barot at that moment in
So
time.
at that point, that's all they had. We can come back to that, but maybe before we sort of think about that, we need to think about another aspect of this, which is the CPS guidance around forensic linguistics. So I'm going to do a little bit of a potted history of authorship analysis here. So there had been, sort of around the early to mid-90s, there was a scholar by the name of the Reverend Andrew Morton, and he was a scholar of the Bible, essentially. And what he did was he developed this method, or invented this method, for determining authorship of biblical texts, and took it to court. And this was known as the Q-sum, which is short for cumulative sum analysis. So this, and it basically led to a series of acquittals on the basis that police had falsified confessions. But it had been tested and it was shown to be kind of quite nonsensical, I believe. Yeah.
It was the subject of my master's thesis.
Oh,
So
yes.
I was very, very junior back then, but my master's thesis, I tested Q-sum analysis
And it
and showed it was nonsense.
just,
But the authorities depended on much more senior and more impressive academics to
Okay, so
come up with their policies.
so this had still been used essentially for a number of acquittals. But by the early 2000s, the Crown Prosecution Service had a publicly available guidance note, and this is it goes along these lines.
Text analysis is an example of a technique which is not considered to be suitably reliable to be used by the prosecution in criminal proceedings. The analysis of text to determine authorship is the subject of much debate among experts. Caution must therefore be exercised in the use or acceptance of evidence on the method of text analysis. In particular, expert evidence based on the cumulative sum method of text analysis is not accepted by the CPS as valid for use in criminal proceedings.
So this was the CPS's, so the Crown Prosecution Service for our overseas listeners, the CPS official view on all forms of text analysis, and then particularly Q-sum analysis, that it was not dependable. And Janet and I were aware that this was in their official guidance. It was up on their website and in various official documents. And so I remember it was quite late on I was going to say Thursday night, the Friday morning probably, that when the CPS lawyer came in, we said, are you aware of this? You're asking us to produce language analysis evidence, and on your own guidance, it says it shouldn't be depended upon and shouldn't be used in court. And we sort of gently suggested that they might want to change the wording a little. And as if by magic,
They did.
because the prosecution had to depend on this evidence, the wording was changed, and a result of which the Barot reports were the first reports used in prosecution decisions that included a forensic authorship analysis in the UK.
So the official guidance talks about text analysis.
Yes, and I mean, this obviously wasn't written by linguists. This official policy guidance it was written by a CPS administrator or lawyer or someone. And the problem with this official statement was its generality. It seemed by ruling out text analysis, it rules out all forms of authorship analysis, not just Q-sum analysis. So we got it made much more specific. And we got it saying that, there are some forms of text analysis that are considered reliable and that it should be looked at carefully, but might be useful in prosecutions.
Right.
And so the guidance was revised, not quite retrospectively, but on the fly alongside this case to enable the Crown prosecutors to rely on our authorship analysis.
Okay.
And as a result of this, the Barot reports were the first prosecution use of a forensic authorship analysis in the UK to make a charging decision or to prepare for court. As we'll hear in a minute, it didn't actually reach court. And it opened the way for prosecutors to use forensic linguistics as evidence in the UK. So after that report had been delivered and put to Barot, I did lots and lots of further analyses in the next 18 months or so, including all the other texts that we've talked about, the known undisputed texts. And at the center of that analysis was that handful of features, basically 5 features, that we arrived at on the original night. I did come up with additional features, but the core analysis was just based around those 5 features and the subsequent work to show that they were indeed distinctive, both individually and as a collection.
Okay, so you're carrying out all this additional work after the point that he's charged. The police were also working hard. And by the time we get to spring 2006, they were ready to go to trial, basically. So we've got loads and loads of evidence about Barot and his planned crimes and all the activities he'd been involved in the run up to his arrest. There were two important preliminary hearings. So first, there was a hearing about the admissibility of the linguistic evidence. So your evidence, basically, the evidence that was used at charge. And the judge decided that it was for the jury to decide about the strength of that evidence.
Yeah, this is quite a traditional view of adversarial admissibility. If you've got the qualifications and experience,
Yeah.
then the jury should decide if it's rigorous enough in a jury trial. These days, things have moved on a little bit, as we've discussed in previous episodes of Righting Wrongs.
Yeah. So in our jurisdiction, any evidence that comes to light after the charge, you need to apply to the court to have that introduced at trial. So in the run up to the case, there was just the linguistics, and then all this other evidence that the police had collected afterwards. There was potentially that might be rejected. So they had a further hearing on this, like whether the new evidence that was collected after he'd been charged could be included at trial, and the judge found that yes, it could. He found in favor of the prosecution.
So this was the big moment. So up until that judgment, the whole prosecution might have had to rest on the linguistic evidence.
Yeah.
Once the judge had decided that all this additional evidence, the work of 18 months, 2 years of policing, could be admitted, or most of it could be admitted, which was traditional policing, not the intelligent spooky stuff that we were talking about earlier. Traditional policing of his networks, his analysis of all his computers and devices, witness statements, all of that about what he had been doing. That stuff was the trial judge decided could be admitted as evidence in the court. So suddenly, rather than just a thin linguistic analysis, there was a whole pile of evidence against him.
Yeah, it must have been quite a relief.
It was a huge relief, yes.
Yeah. So this is the point at which Barot changes his plea, so he pleads guilty. Thoughts about that?
Yeah, it's interesting, isn't it? Because again, there are murky suggestions as to, in the literatures I've been reading, as to why he pleaded guilty. Was he threatened with going to Guantanamo Bay and all sorts of awful things like that? Or was it simply that his barristers, his lawyers, said, look, there's so much evidence against you, now it's all been admitted? And so I don't know which of those to think about. I was really scared that I would be the only expert witness at trial, the only witness at trial giving my evidence. So yes, enormous relief. And in fact, prior to the run up to the trial, and it was about the spring of 2006. Up until that point, Janet had been chosen to give the evidence,
Right.
and this was a variety of reasons. She had stayed behind a little bit in New Scotland Yard after I had to leave and looked at another document, which sort of set the tone for it. But then, and also, she had one court appearance, I had none at that point.
Okay.
So that
She was the more experienced.
she was definitely the more experienced one. But unfortunately, Janet, and she said to me, she thought it was the pressure of this actually was part of why she became seriously ill. She became seriously ill and had to withdraw from being the person giving the evidence. So that's when I sort of took over, and which, as I've said, was a pretty terrifying prospect. And in fact, amongst others, Michael Mansfield had been, who's a very eminent British barrister, had been hired to prepare the defence for Barot and his colleagues. And in fact, Nikki, I've got a surprise for you here. So what I've got is a letter, and I won't say the name of the solicitors,
Okay.
but it was written to me. I'm the addressee.
Yeah.
And it is from a defence firm of solicitors who are representing Barot and others. And I received this in May 2006. So I thought it might be quite fun for you to read out paragraph 1 and paragraph 10 of that.
1 and 10. Okay. So we represent Dhiren Barot, one of 8 defendants charged with serious terrorism offences, which are due to be heard at Woolwich Crown Court on a trial starting on the 4th of September 2006. According to the Crown's witness, Janet Cotterill and Timothy Grant, by an exercise of expert linguistic analysis of various documents, there is evidence ranging from slight to strong of authorial similarity between a number of incriminating items that have been recovered, and crucially between a number of crucial items such as the USA plans and the Gas Limo project, and known writings of the defendant, Dhiren Barot. So they're asking if you'll stand against yourself.
Yes, they were asking me to work for the defence against myself. This has happened 2 or 3 times in my career,
Really?
where a defence lister writes to me saying, we've got some linguistic evidence. Would you be prepared to comment on it?
Yeah,
And I-
some bloke called Tim Grant.
Some bloke called Tim Grant has provided it. So I didn't take up that commercial opportunity.
Right.
It was already messy enough.
Okay. And Jess, you'd presumably not heard much for months after you'd kind of left New Scotland Yard. So what were your thoughts about, when obviously the guilty plea was made public? There was a lot of press around that, I think. What were your sort of thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, I was mixed feelings, I think. I was pleased for Tim and Janet that had happened. But I think it was also quite sad because, he was an intelligent young man who you felt had lots of potential, and it felt like a complete waste of his life. So I think there were mixed feelings from that point of view.
So, yes, in terms of sentencing, Barot initially, he received a life sentence with a minimum of 40 years imprisonment. And actually, if you think about it, he had never carried out any of his plan. And that was some of the basis of his appeal. So he appealed against the severity of the sentence, and the minimum term is 30 years, was reduced to 30 years on appeal. And when you read about the time he had in prison, quite early on, he was viciously attacked in prison,
Right.
and was in seclusion for being a vulnerable prisoner. There's a very nasty form of prison attack where boiling sugared water was poured over him. It's referred to as jugging. And so he was a victim of that within prison. So he had a pretty torrid time in the British prison system.
Jess, do you have any kind of final thoughts on this, whether it's about how the problem was approached or your involvement in general or anything?
Yeah, I think for me it gave me really important insight into how authorship analysis actually works in practice, and how the considerations of what makes for a robust authorship analysis are really similar to what makes for a robust crime linkage analysis. So, for example, the consideration of distinctiveness. But I think for me, I was quite early in my career. I think it was also an important experience in terms of maintaining your independence and your scientific approach despite being in a high pressure situation.
Yeah, it's difficult to conceive of a more high pressure situation.
Yeah, and I try not to say. Well, it's difficult because there's an ethic. We've talked about the ethics of where the documents came from and the sources of bias, but the alternative is to say no, I won't help. Yeah, and that's an ethical decision as well.
Yeah.
So there's not easy answers in this, but I think just trying to be as professional as you can, given the circumstance, is all that we can do, I think.
Yeah, and I think I remember you and Janet being really mindful of that, and us having a conversation as a team when we arrived at the beginning and saying this is a high pressure situation. We need to try and distance ourselves from that, and trying to set the room up to minimise that overt feeling of pressure that was otherwise falling on our shoulders.
Yeah. And yes, in spite of everyone barging in, tapping their watches and saying, come on, come up with the goods. So I'm interested, Jess, in these parallels. We've been interested all our careers in the parallels, and we're doing some current work looking at parallels between authorship analysis and the crime linkage work that you do. But you, I know, gave evidence in a Scottish trial about your work on case linkage, and you were arguing that it shouldn't be admitted by the courts. So I'm interested in that and what that case was about.
Yeah, so this was the case of Her Majesty's Advocate versus Thomas Ross Young. So it was an appeal case, so slightly different to this one. But the circumstances were that Thomas Ross Young had been convicted many years before of a murder of a lady in Scotland, and her murder had then subsequently been linked through crime linkage analysis to other murders, and therefore the question was, was he actually responsible for the murder he'd been convicted of and then imprisoned? And I was asked to give evidence as an expert in terms of what is the reliability of crime linkage analysis. So again, was considering things like the importance of considering distinctiveness when you identify evidence of consistency, the importance of how you determine that something's distinctive. So luckily in crime linkage analysis, we have these databases where we can generate the base rates of behaviour to be able to empirically demonstrate that this behaviour that's shared across crimes is actually rare and be able to put numbers to that. So I think there were quite a lot of similarities, but my feeling was at the time, and I'd probably say so still now, that crime linkage analysis is an investigative tool which is used to open up leads that the police can then pursue themselves to identify other evidence.
Yeah, that makes a difference between the authorship analysis. I think they're structurally really similar. So I'm interested in this contrast that authorship analysis is now, if done properly, done well, moderately well accepted in the British courts, yet case linkage analysis hasn't been accepted as evidence in the British court. So in spite of the parallels we've talked about, there's that difference.
Yeah.
Definitely. So, Tim, I think before we wrap up, there's a final kind of political postscript to all this.
Yes. So this is about the various laws, the counterterrorism laws brought in the early 2000s. It was apparently directly because of the Barot case that the then Prime Minister, Tony Blair, proposed in the 2006 Terrorism Act that for terrorist offences, suspects should be able to be held for 90 days before being brought to charge. And this created a huge storm in Parliament amongst civil liberties activists, and they were saying 90 days without charge. And what it was trying to do was tackle this problem that you might have an arrest with no evidence, and that's basically when the investigation starts, rather than normal police procedure is you do your investigation, you gather a pile of evidence, and then you put it to the suspect and charge them. It's that reversal that it was trying to tackle. But Parliament wasn't happy. It rejected that proposal for a 90-day pre-charge holding period, but did allow for a 28-day period that was passed, but with a sunset clause, so it had to be renewed annually.
Okay.
The government tried again in 2008 for a 42-day period, but that failed as well. But the sunset clause, which required annual renewal, finally lapsed in 2010. So even for terrorism investigations, still that period of holding is 14 days, which is more than it is for regular crimes.
That's 24 hours, isn't it, for suspects in other non-terror related crimes. So that's interesting, isn't it? Really, I mean, based on what you've said, is 14 days kind of? Well, I mean, it was 14 days in the case of Barot, wasn't it? And what are your thoughts on that?
I don't know. Clearly, it proved to be just enough.
Just enough.
And I wonder a little bit, is it whatever the length, whether people will do what's necessary, length given? And you could argue that more time would have been better, and it certainly would. But then I think these legal deadlines are always in place. And I certainly think civil liberties piece, I'd be against a very extended
Yeah, I mean, 90 days, 3 months is
a lot of time.
Excessive.
Particularly, I mean, given the adjacency to allegations of torture and other things in this case. There were apparently, the British state said there were no British persons present. There's dispute over that. So they say there may have been British observers at some of these events and so on. But, that it opens up that possibility, doesn't it, of coercion, even if not torture, coercion of different sorts.
Yeah. Okay, so I think we're ready to bring this double episode to a close. Before we do, I'd like to thank Jess for joining our discussion today and for contributing all your thoughts. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you, Jess. It's been great to meet up again. If you've got a question about this episode, other episodes, or anything in Righting Wrongs, remember you can get in touch with the show via email, rightingwrongs@aston.ac.uk, or just contact us on social media through our personal or AIFL accounts on Twitter, LinkedIn, and Instagram.
If you've been affected by any of the themes in this week's episode, please consider contacting the resources in the episode description.
This has been Righting Wrongs, an original podcast series from the Aston Institute for Forensic Linguistics at Aston University. We'll see you next time. Goodbye.
Goodbye.